Preston Fowler's fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the steering wheel as he navigated through the congested streets of downtown. At 45, the architect had built a reputation for innovative, sustainable designs, but today his mind was consumed by the eco-friendly skyscraper project that was eating up his time and sanity in equal measure. As he pulled into the driveway of his suburban home, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. The front door swung open before he could reach for his keys. Jessica, his wife of 20 years, practically bounced out to greet him. Her enthusiasm seemed oddly out of place. "Preston, darling, you're home early," she chirped, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that made him pause. He glanced at his watch. "It's past 8, Jess." "Oh, is it?" She laughed. The sound had touched too high. "I guess I lost track of time. How was your day?" Preston raised an eyebrow, curiosity momentarily overriding his exhaustion. "Same as always. Meetings, revisions, more meetings. You seem chipper." Jessica's smile widened. "I have a surprise for you," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. "A surprise?" Preston echoed, his fatigue-addled brain struggling to keep up. "Meet me at the Regal Hotel tomorrow, at 7 p.m. Don't be late." The enthusiasm in her voice felt off, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. But Preston, his mind still half occupied with work concerns, simply nodded. "All right," he said, stepping past her into the house. "I'll be there. Now, if you don't mind, I need a shower." As the hot water pounded against his back, Preston's thoughts drifted. Their marriage had been distant lately. True. The passion that once burned between them had cooled to embers. But he'd been working hard, building a future for them both. Surely Jessica understood that. He stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around his waist. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. Probably already asleep, he thought, or pretending to be. He sighed, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. The next evening, Preston arrived at the Regal Hotel precisely at 7 p.m., a bouquet of roses in hand. The concierge, a young man with a polite smile, directed him to a suite on the top floor. "Enjoy your evening, sir," the concierge said, a hint of knowing in his voice that made Preston's skin prickle. As the elevator ascended, a mix of anticipation and unease settled in his stomach. What was Jessica playing at? Was this her way of rekindling their romance? He knocked on the suite door, straightening his tie with his free hand. The door swung open to reveal Jessica, but she wasn't alone. A man Preston had never seen before stood behind her, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Hello, Preston," Jessica said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You're right on time. Always so dependable." Preston's eyes darted between Jessica and the stranger. "What's going on here, Jess?" Jessica's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Meet Antonio, my high school sweetheart. Your surprise is this: I'm leaving you." Preston stood frozen, his mind refusing to process the words. Antonio sauntered forward, draping his arm around Jessica's waist. "Thanks for keeping her warm for me, chump," Antonio sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious glee. Jessica's eyes, once warm and loving, now held only cold contempt. She tossed an envelope at Preston's feet. "Divorce papers. I've already transferred your retirement funds to my account." She paused, savoring the shock on Preston's face. "Oh, and here's a one-way ticket to Alaska. Why don't you go cool off?" The roses slipped from Preston's grasp, scattering across the plush hotel carpet. He stared at the fallen flowers, his mind reeling. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Antonio laughed, the sound grating on Preston's nerves. "Oh, she's dead serious, buddy. You snooze, you lose." Preston's shock began to give way to anger. He took a step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you can just throw away 20 years of marriage for this high school fling?" Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Watch it, Preston. Don't make a scene. It's over. Accept it and move on." "Move on?" Preston's voice rose. You've stolen my money, my future, and you expect me to just move on. Antonio stepped between them. His chest puffed out. You heard the lady. It's over. Now why don't you take that ticket and disappear? Before things got unpleasant, Preston's eyes locked with Jessica's. For a moment, he searched for any sign of the woman he'd loved for 2 decades. He found nothing but cold indifference. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low and steady. Both of you. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the roses scattered on the floor behind him. Days blurred together as Preston grappled with the betrayal. He found himself sitting in his lawyer's office, the tasteful decor a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. Cameron Schneider, a sharp-eyed attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness in divorce cases, reviewed the situation. Preston, I've got good news and bad news, Cameron said, leaning back in his leather chair. The good news is the transfer of your retirement funds was illegal. We can sue for fraud. Preston leaned forward, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. And the bad news. Cameron's expression turned grim. Jessica's filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. She's moving fast, trying to get ahead of us. Preston's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. She's the one with differences, like preferring her high school fling to her husband of 2 decades. I understand you're angry, Preston, Cameron said, his tone measured. But we need to approach this strategically. Emotion won't win this battle. Preston nodded, forcing himself to take a deep breath. You're right. What's our next move? Cameron pulled out a file, spreading documents across his desk. We counterfile, citing adultery. It won't stop the divorce, but it could affect the division of assets. Do it, Preston said without hesitation. Cameron nodded, then hesitated. There's more. Jessica's visa is tied to your marriage. If we report the fraud, it'll be canceled. A glimmer of resolve sparked in Preston's eyes. Do it. And Cameron, I want everything we can legally throw at them. Cameron's lips curled into a predatory smile. Consider it done. We'll hit them so hard they won't know what hit them. As Preston stood to leave, Cameron called out, Preston, one more thing. Don't contact Jessica or that Antonio character. Let them think you're licking your wounds. The element of surprise will be our best weapon. Preston nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Don't worry, Cameron. I've got no interest in talking to either of them, but they'll hear from me soon enough. Preston threw himself into his work, channeling his pain and anger into the skyscraper project. His colleagues noticed the change, the increased intensity in his eyes, the longer hours he put in, but no one dared to mention it. Late one evening, as he was leaving the office, a conversation between 2 junior architects caught his attention. Did you hear about that international competition? One asked, excitement evident in his voice. Yeah, the Sustainable City Project, right? The other replied. The prize is huge. Preston slowed his pace, listening intently. But there's a catch. The first one continued. You need to work with a partner from a developing country. Seriously, that's going to make things complicated. Preston paused, an idea forming. He turned back, startling the 2 younger men. Tell me more about this competition, he said, his tone brooking no argument. 20 minutes later, Preston was back at his desk, furiously researching. Hours ticked by as he scoured the internet, looking for the perfect partner. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across his office, he stumbled upon a promising lead. A talented but unknown architect in Jessica's home country. A smile spread across Preston's face. 2 birds, 1 stone, he muttered, reaching for his phone to make travel arrangements. As he booked his flight, Preston's mind raced with possibilities. This wasn't just about winning a competition anymore. It was about rebuilding his life and exacting justice. Jessica and Antonio had tried to break him, but they'd only succeeded in unleashing a side of him they never knew existed. He pulled up Jessica's social media profiles, noting with disgust the lovey-dovey photos she'd already posted with Antonio. Enjoy it while it lasts, he muttered, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, he considered leaving a scathing comment. But no, that would tip his hand. Instead, he closed the browser and pulled up his email. He had work to do, plans to make. Jessica and Antonio thought they'd won, that they'd left him broken and defeated. They couldn't be more wrong. Preston Fowler, the mild-mannered architect, was gone. In his place stood a man determined to not just survive, but to thrive, and to make those who betrayed him pay dearly for their mistakes. As the first rays of sunlight crept through his office window, Preston allowed himself a moment of reflection. The pain of betrayal still burned, but it was fuel now, driving him forward. He trusted too easily, loved too blindly, never again. He picked up the phone, dialing Cameron's number. It was early, but he knew his lawyer would be up. "Cameron, it's Preston. I need you to do something for me." The stale air of the airplane cabin did little to clear Preston's head as he touched down in Jessica's home country. The 14-hour flight had given him ample time to stew in his anger, to plot his next moves. As he stepped off the plane, he straightened his tie and set his jaw. This wasn't just a business trip. This was war. Preston's contact, a local architect named Maureen, was waiting for him at the arrivals gate. "Mr. Fowler?" she asked, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. Preston nodded, shaking her hand. "Call me Preston. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Maureen." They made their way to a nearby cafe, the bustle of the airport fading into background noise. As they sat down with their coffees, Maureen got straight to the point. "Your email was intriguing," she said, her eyes studying Preston's face. "But I have to ask, why me? You're already successful. You could partner with anyone for this competition." Preston took a sip of his coffee, buying himself a moment to choose his words carefully. "Your designs are revolutionary," he said, meeting her gaze. "I've been following your work for a while now. The way you integrate local materials and traditional techniques into modern, sustainable structures. It's exactly what this competition is looking for." Maureen's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Flattery will get you nowhere, Mr. Fowler. What's the real reason?" Preston's lips twitched in a hint of a smile. He appreciated her directness. "All right. Cards on the table. I'm going through a personal upheaval. My wife left me, tried to clean out my accounts. I need this win, both professionally and personally. And I believe that together, we could not only win this competition, but change the face of sustainable architecture." He watched Maureen process this information, her expression unreadable. "And what do I get out of this, besides a chance at a prize that's not guaranteed?" she asked. "Exposure," Preston said without hesitation. "Win or lose, you'll be working with one of the top firms in sustainable design. It's a foot in the door of an industry that, let's face it, isn't always welcoming to women, especially in this part of the world." Maureen's eyes narrowed, but Preston could see the spark of interest there. "You've done your homework," she said. Preston nodded. "I believe in being prepared. So what do you say? Partners?" Maureen was silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping a rhythmless beat on the table. Finally, she extended her hand. "Partners," she said. "But I warn you, Mr. Fowler, I don't tolerate being used or manipulated. If I sense any funny business, I'm out." "Understood." Preston shook her hand, a genuine smile crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "Understood. And please, it's Preston. We're partners now, after all." As they left the cafe, diving into the humid air of the city, Preston felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The first piece of his plan was in place. Jessica and Antonio might think they'd broken him, but they had no idea what was coming. Across the ocean, Jessica and Antonio were living it up, oblivious to the storm brewing. They moved into a penthouse apartment, paid for with Preston's stolen retirement funds. Jessica lounged by the rooftop pool, sipping champagne as Antonio massaged her shoulders. "You know," Antonio said, his hands working out a knot in Jessica's neck. "I could get used to this life." Jessica laughed, the sound echoing across the empty rooftop. "Well, get used to it, baby. We've got plenty to spare." Antonio's hands paused. "About that, how long do you think it'll take before the money transfer gets noticed?" Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "Please, Preston's probably crying into his blueprints right now. By the time he figures it out, if he ever does, we'll be long gone." She turned, pulling Antonio in for a kiss. "Now stop worrying and pour me another glass. We've got a lot of lost time to make up for," as they clinked their glasses together. Neither of them noticed the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The storm was coming, whether they were ready or not. Preston hunched over the drafting table, his pen flying across the paper. Across from him, Maureen was deep in concentration, her computer screen flickering with complex 3D models. They'd been working non-stop for weeks. Their designs for a self-sustaining city were taking shape before their eyes. "What if we integrated vertical farming here?" Maureen suggested, pointing to a section of the model. "It would increase food production and add a unique aesthetic element." Preston nodded, quickly sketching the idea. "Brilliant, and if we use native plants, it'll tie into the local ecosystem." Their partnership had flourished beyond Preston's wildest expectations. Maureen's innovative ideas perfectly complemented his technical expertise. As their design gained traction in the competition, Preston felt a surge of satisfaction. This was more than just a professional triumph. It was the first step in his plan for revenge. But even as he threw himself into the project, Preston hadn't forgotten about Jessica. In his spare moments, he'd been discreetly gathering information about her past in her home country. Every scrap of intel was carefully filed away. Ammunition for the battle to come. His phone buzzed, Cameron's name flashing on the screen. Preston excused himself, stepping out onto the balcony of their rented workspace. "Cameron, what's the news?" His lawyer's voice crackled over the line. "The fraud case is solid, Preston. We've got her dead to rights on the retirement fund transfer. But there's more. We're pushing for an annulment based on Jessica's infidelity." Preston's grip tightened on the phone. "Excellent. What's the catch?" he asked. "But there's a complication. She's trying to claim half your business assets. Said she supported you while you built the company. So she's entitled to a share." Preston's eyes narrowed, his free hand clenching into a fist. "Not for long, she's not." "What are you planning, Preston?" Cameron asked, a note of concern in his voice. "Don't worry about it," Preston said. "Just keep the legal pressure on. I'll handle the rest." He ended the call, his mind already racing. Jessica thought she could take half this company. She had another thing coming. Over the next few days, Preston initiated a series of careful maneuvers. He restructured his company, moving assets into protected trusts and offshore accounts. It was all perfectly legal, if a bit ethically gray. But Preston was past caring about ethics. This was about survival. As he worked, he kept one eye on the competition. Their design was gaining attention. Industry insiders were whispering about the dark horse team that was shaking things up. Preston allowed himself a smile. Let Jessica and Antonio think they'd won. The game is just beginning. Jessica frowned at the bank statement, her manicured nail tapping against the screen of her tablet. "Antonio," she called, her voice sharp. "Come look at this." Antonio sauntered in from the bedroom, still buttoning up his silk shirt. "What is it, babe?" "The money," Jessica said, thrusting the tablet at him. "It's not all there." Antonio's brow furrowed as he looked at the numbers. "What do you mean? Did you spend more than you thought?" Jessica shot him a glare. "Don't be foolish. I know exactly how much I spent. This is something else." She paced the room, her mind racing. "It's Preston. It has to be that sneaky person is up to something." Antonio flopped onto the couch, looking unconcerned. "So what? We still have plenty. And by the time he figures it out, if he ever does, we'll be long gone." Jessica whirled on him, her eyes flashing. "You don't get it, Do you? This isn't just about the money. It's about winning. And I refuse to let that pathetic excuse for a man beat me. She grabbed her phone, furiously tapping out a message. We need to hit back. Hard. What are you thinking? Antonio asked, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice. Preston's always been so proud of his precious skyscraper project. What if something were to go wrong? Over the next few days, Jessica and Antonio launched their counterattack. They spread rumors about structural instabilities in Preston's eco-friendly skyscraper, whispering to investors and city officials about potential safety hazards. But Preston was one step ahead. He'd anticipated their move, had been preparing for it since the moment Jessica betrayed him. Every stage of the project had been meticulously documented, every safety measure triple-checked and verified by independent experts. When the rumors reached fever pitch, Preston calmly presented his evidence. Blueprints, safety reports, material analysis, all laid out in a press conference that left no room for doubt. The attempted sabotage backfired spectacularly, damaging Jessica and Antonio's credibility instead. As Preston wrapped up the press conference, fielding questions from reporters with ease, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Maureen. Saw the news. Nicely done. But we got work to do. Competition deadlines coming up. Preston allowed himself a small smile as he texted back. On my way, let's show them what real innovation looks like. Across town, Jessica threw her phone against the wall, watching with satisfaction as it shattered. That person, she seethed. How does he always stay one step ahead? Antonio, lounging on the couch, barely looked up from his magazine. Maybe it's time to cut our losses, babe. We've still got enough. Enough. Jessica interrupted, her voice rising to a shriek. It's not about enough. It's about winning. And I refuse to let Preston win. She stormed over to the liquor cabinet, pouring herself a generous glass of scotch. As she drank, her mind raced. The money was dwindling faster than she'd anticipated. Preston was outmaneuvering her at every turn. She needed to act fast. We need to speed up the divorce proceedings, she said, more to herself than to Antonio. Secure what assets we can before Preston can protect them all. Antonio finally looked up, a hint of concern in his eyes. Jess, maybe we should shut up. Jessica snapped. I'm not asking for your opinion. Just do as I say. Got it. As Antonio nodded meekly, Jessica turned to stare out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Preston was plotting his next move, but she'd be damned if she'd let him win. This war was far from over. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Architects, investors, and media from around the world had gathered for the final presentations of the International Sustainable City Design Competition. Preston stood backstage, his heart pounding. Months of work, sleepless nights, and relentless planning had led to this moment. Maureen approached, her face a mask of calm determination. Ready? Preston nodded, straightening his tie. Born ready. As they waited for their turn, Preston's eyes scanned the audience. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted two familiar faces. Jessica and Antonio sat near the back, whispering to each other and smirking. Looks like we have some unexpected guests, Maureen muttered, following Preston's gaze. Preston's jaw clenched. Good. Let them watch. Next up, presenting their design for a self-sustaining urban ecosystem, Preston Fowler and Maureen Kigali. The announcer's voice boomed. As they took the stage, Preston locked eyes with Jessica for a brief moment. Her smug smile only fueled his determination. He turned to the judges, his voice steady and confident as he began their presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see isn't just a city. It's a living, breathing ecosystem that will revolutionize urban living. For the next 30 minutes, Preston and Maureen laid out their vision. They detailed the vertical farms integrated into residential towers, the revolutionary waste management system that turned garbage into energy, and the network of green spaces that served both recreational and environmental purposes. As Maureen explained the cultural aspects of their design, Preston glanced at Jessica and Antonio. Their smiles had faded, replaced by looks of growing unease. The judges peppered them with questions, which Preston and Maureen fielded with ease. Their preparation paid off as they addressed every concern and elaborated on the finer points of their design. As they concluded, the audience erupted into applause. Preston allowed himself a small smile. "We nailed it." Hours later, after all the presentations were complete, the judges returned to announce the winner. After careful deliberation, the head judge began. "We are pleased to announce that the winner of this year's International Sustainable City Design Competition is Preston Fowler and Maureen Kigali." The auditorium exploded with cheers. Preston and Maureen embraced, both of them grinning from ear to ear. As they made their way to the stage to accept their award, Preston caught sight of Jessica and Antonio slinking towards the exit. Their faces twisted with anger and disappointment. The next hour was a whirlwind of congratulations, interviews, and handshakes. Preston's phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues and potential clients. This win wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a game changer for his career. As the crowd began to thin, Preston spotted Jessica making her way towards him. Her face was a mask of false cheer, but he could see the calculation in her eyes. "Preston, darling," she called, her voice sickly sweet. "Congratulations on your win. I always knew you had it in you." Preston turned to face her, his expression cold. "Save it, Jessica. We both know you came here hoping to see me fail." Jessica's smile faltered. "Now that's not fair." "You what?" Preston interrupted. "Thought you'd swoop in and take credit. Try to weasel your way back into my life now that I'm successful again." He leaned in close, his voice low. "Let me make this clear. You're nothing to me now. Nothing but a mistake. I'm in the process of erasing." Jessica's face contorted with rage. "You think you've won. This isn't over." Preston smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that made Jessica take a step back. "Oh, it's far from over. But trust me, you won't like how it ends." He turned his back on her, rejoining Maureen and a group of investors who were eagerly discussing future projects. As he engaged in the conversation, Preston could feel Jessica's glare boring into his back. But for the first time since her betrayal, he felt nothing but satisfaction. The tables had turned, and Jessica was about to learn just how badly she'd miscalculated. The courthouse loomed before Preston, a monument to justice that would soon become the stage for his final act of retribution. He straightened his tie, his face a mask of calm determination as he climbed the steps. Inside, he found Cameron waiting, a thick briefcase in hand. "Ready for this?" the lawyer asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Preston nodded, more than ready. "Let's finish this." They entered the courtroom, the wooden doors creaking ominously behind them. Jessica and Antonio were already there, huddled with their lawyer. Jessica shot Preston a venomous glare as he took his seat, but he ignored her, focusing instead on the task at hand. The judge entered, and the court fell silent. "We're here today in the matter of Fowler versus Fowler," she announced, her voice echoing in the hushed room. "Mr. Schneider, you may present your case." Cameron stood, his presence commanding the room. "Your Honor, what we have here is not just a simple divorce case. This is a story of betrayal, fraud, and malicious intent." Over the next hour, Cameron laid out their case with surgical precision. He presented evidence of Jessica's infidelity, complete with time-stamped photos and hotel receipts. He detailed the illegal transfer of Preston's retirement funds, showing bank statements and tracing the money trail. "But Your Honor," Cameron continued, his voice rising with controlled indignation, "the defendant's actions go beyond mere infidelity and theft. They actively attempted to sabotage my client's professional reputation." He presented affidavits from investors and city officials, revealing Jessica and Antonio's attempts to spread false rumors about Preston's skyscraper project. Email trails and recorded phone calls painted a damning picture of their malicious campaign. As Cameron spoke, Preston watched Jessica's face. Her confident smirk had long since faded, replaced by a look of growing panic. Antonio, for his part, looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Cameron said, producing a final set of documents, "we have evidence of the defendant's past indiscretions in her home country. Actions that, if brought to light, could have serious consequences for her immigration status." Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected this, hadn't realized how thoroughly Preston had investigated her past. The judge's face grew increasingly stern as she reviewed the evidence. When Cameron finally concluded, she turned to Jessica's lawyer. "Counselor, do you have anything to add in your client's defense?" Jessica's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who seemed out of his depth, stuttered through a weak rebuttal. His argument sounded hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence Cameron had presented. After a brief recess, the judge returned to deliver her verdict. The courtroom held its breath. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, the judge began, her voice filled with disgust. "I rule entirely in favor of the plaintiff, Preston Fowler. The marriage is hereby annulled on grounds of fraud and infidelity. All of Mrs. Fowler's claims to Mr. Fowler's assets are dismissed." Preston allowed himself a small smile as the judge continued. "Furthermore, Mrs. Fowler is ordered to repay the stolen retirement funds with interest, and given the evidence of her past indiscretions and current illegal activities, I am recommending a full investigation into her immigration status." Jessica's face drained of color. She turned to Antonio, but he was already inching away from her, his eyes darting towards the exit. As the judge's gavel fell, Preston stood, buttoning his jacket. He looked at Jessica, seeing not the woman he had loved for 20 years, but a stranger who had tried to destroy him. "I told you this wasn't over," he said quietly as he passed her. "Enjoy your trip home." Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for a statement. Preston paused on the steps, Cameron at his side. "Mr. Fowler, how do you feel about the verdict?" Preston straightened his tie, his face a mask of professional calm. "Justice has been served," he said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a city to build." As he walked away, leaving the chaos behind him, Preston felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The betrayal that had nearly broken him was now nothing more than a closed chapter in his life. Ahead lay new challenges, new triumphs. And this time, he'd face them on his own terms. Months passed like pages turning in a book, each one filled with victories, both personal and professional. Preston stood atop his completed skyscraper, the wind whipping at his suit as he surveyed the city sprawling below. The eco-friendly building was a testament to his vision, a gleaming beacon of sustainable architecture that had already become a landmark. The door to the roof opened, and Maureen stepped out to join him. In the month since their competition win, she had become more than just a partner. She was a friend, a confidant, and a driving force in their newly formed international firm. "Quite a view," Maureen said, coming to stand beside him. "Hard to believe how far we've come in such a short time." Preston nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's been quite a journey." Maureen leaned against the railing, her eyes sparkling with barely contained excitement. "I've got some news," she said. "I heard through the grapevine about Jessica and Antonio." Preston raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "Oh, they were last seen arguing at the airport," Maureen said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Apparently, he dumped her when the money ran out, left her high and dry at the departure gate." Preston absorbed this information, surprised to find that he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, not even pity. "Karma," he said simply. Maureen studied his face for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with what she saw. "So," she said, changing the subject, "shall we discuss our next project? I've got some ideas for that renewal contract in Singapore." As they delved into the details of their upcoming work, Preston found his mind wandering. He thought about the man he had been just a year ago. Trusting, naive, blindsided by betrayal. That man was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more cautious, but also more fulfilled. The betrayal had nearly broken him. It was true. But from those broken pieces, he had built something far greater than he had ever imagined. A thriving international firm, a reputation as a pioneer in sustainable architecture, and genuine connections with people who valued him for his skills and his character, not what they could take from him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Preston allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had not just survived. He had thrived. The city below, with its bustling streets and soaring buildings, seemed to pulse with possibility, and he was ready to shape it, one innovative design at a time. "You know," he said to Maureen, interrupting her mid-sentence about solar panel efficiency, "I think we're going to need a bigger office." Maureen laughed, the sound carried away by the wind. "Dreaming big again, are we?" Preston smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. "Always," he said. "After all, why stop now?" As they turned their heads back inside, Preston cast one last look at the city skyline. The past was behind him, a closed book, an endless future limited only by his imagination and will. And for the first time in a long time, Preston Fowler was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.